listen to scary stories and then you see things that aren't even scary. Even if it's right, they wouldn't be scary, but you're so jumpy. Like, I just went downstairs to pet my dog, and in the reflection of the window, I saw this painting I have of a cake, but in the reflection of the window, it looked like a face, and I freaked out for no reason. Or I just went to put on this lipstick, and I was closing the medicine cabinet, and there were 2 smudges on the mirror that I hadn't noticed before, and I was like, oh, I'm clearly going to die tonight. Anyway, I'll be fine, and so will you. These stories are from Jezebel's annual Scary Story contest, so I'll leave the link in the description if you are interested. But this is also where I get my stories for these videos, so if you're hoping to watch another, then I would not read them if you want to be surprised. And I myself have not read these, so I don't know what's happening until I read it to you, so we're on the same page. Okay, this first story is called, story number 111, it's called, I think, Old Gray Thing. Yep, Old Gray Thing. I lost my home and job in Katrina in 2005, Hurricane Katrina. I returned to New Orleans a month later to salvage my possessions and found a job doing disaster relief for FEMA. Since 80% of the city's housing was destroyed, it was nearly impossible to find a safe, clean, and affordable place to live. After sleeping in my car and on friends' couches for several weeks, I found a furnished studio apartment in the French Quarter at a surprisingly low price. It was filthy, infested with roaches, and had creepy art all over the walls, but it was my only housing option, so I rolled up my sleeves, enthusiastically cleaned, repainted, and moved on. Everything was fine until around Thanksgiving, when someone delivered flowers to the apartment. The card read, "Dear man's name, rest in peace. Love, your family." Family apparently was capitalized. I figured someone had delivered them to the wrong address, but they looked pretty, so I took them inside and put them in a vase. I later told one of my neighbors about the odd delivery, and he went pale and said, "Oh no, you weren't supposed to take those inside." He then informed me that a very depressed, alcoholic young man had lived there a year ago and hung himself one night in the apartment. The ceiling didn't have enough drop room to break his neck, so he slowly strangled. The neighbors heard him choking and kicking the wall in agony and eventually broke down the door and called 911, but it was too late. His windpipe was crushed and he died in the apartment. After that, the new tenants complained of paranormal activity and no one stayed more than a month or 2. They all broke lease and left abruptly, usually leaving all their possessions behind, which is why I got it cheap and furnished. His parents believed his spirit was still there and regularly delivered flowers or gifts to the home, but the neighbors had agreed never to take them inside since it seemed to make the activity worse. Would have been nice to get the memo, but okay. No joke. After that, I also began to experience paranormal activity. I woke up hearing a loud, rhythmic thumping noise in the walls at the same time every night, right where he'd supposedly hung himself. All flowers and plants withered and died within a few hours of bringing them inside the apartment. Objects would move on their own, and anything I hung on the walls would somehow unscrew itself and crash to the floor. Some nights, the bead curtain between the kitchenette and the main room would move on its own, like someone was walking through. It was creepy, but I decided to endure it since I had nowhere else to live. I'm superstitious, but I'm also a pragmatist, and I felt sorry for the young man who died a horrible and lonely death and whose spirit was now trapped within the walls. I would often speak notes his family sent to the house and basically tried to befriend him. The neighbors told me he probably enjoyed having a friendly young woman his own age around. I even created a small altar for him with objects I thought would bring him comfort. But this all turned out to be a big mistake. What? I thought that was a good idea. The bizarre activity continued to escalate over the months, and I became more and more depressed. It wasn't just the apartment. I was working long hours. The city was beyond messed up. And my disaster relief job was traumatic. Everything culminated in a visit from an old friend, a self-described skeptic and atheist, in the spring of 2006. After one night in my apartment, he moved into a hotel and said, "You shouldn't stay in that place anymore. Something bad happened there." Sorry, there's something bad there. A few days later, I was assigned to a nursing home to help the residents process their disaster relief applications. An elder lady I was working with suddenly stopped and said, "God is giving me a word for you, young lady. You're in danger right now. If you stay where you are any longer, you'll die." By that point, I was thoroughly freaked out. I called my landlord and told her I appreciated the cheap place, but I had to move out. She said, "I'm not surprised." I arranged to move in with a friend until I could find somewhere new. Once I began backing up, the paranormal activity escalated violently. The thumping got louder to the point where I couldn't sleep. I also began to experience sleep paralysis. One night I woke up around the same time the thumping usually started, but the room was dead quiet. The bead curtains started moving again, but this time something came through for real. It was vaguely human-shaped, but it wasn't human. Its body was gray and faded out like television static or smoke. It had no hands, feet, or face. I can't do odd movements, you guys. It moved in an unsettling way, shuffling and stooped and jerky, like something very old struggling to walk. No, thank you. No. I laid there frozen in fear as it moved slowly across the room, eventually standing by the bed behind my head, and leaned over until it loomed inches from my face. It let out a strange, high-pitched screech, and then whispered something softly. I can't remember what it said, something intended to be comforting, like, "Don't worry, baby." But as it breathed into my ear, a wave of cold, dark, clammy dread washed over my body. It was the worst sensation I've ever felt in my life. All I can describe it as is a feeling of suicide, of dying alone in darkness and terror with no comfort. Then it faded into the wall and disappeared. I jumped out of the bed, turned all the lights on, and spent the rest of the night frantically packing and throwing things into my car. I was out by morning and slept at my friend's house that night. Early the next morning, I woke up on her couch with sleep paralysis. There was a doorway in her wall that shouldn't be there. It turned out that there had once been a physical doorway there, but had been plastered over into the wall. No. The old gray thing came through again, creeping into the room with the same weird jerking movements. It leaned over me again until it was lying completely on top of me, whispering gentle nonsense in my ear, infecting my entire body with foul, creeping dread. Then it left and the doorway disappeared again. My friend woke up shortly afterward and said she'd had horrible nightmares all night. I threw away every object I owned associated with the apartment and called my mother, a deeply religious woman. "I think a ghost followed me from my old place," I said, and I told her everything that had happened. She was alarmed. "That's not a human spirit," she said. "That's something else, pretending to be one." She sent me to her priest for a blessing. I saw it a few times after that, but eventually it faded away. It seemed to lose power over me the longer I stayed outside the haunted apartment. Years passed, and eventually I never saw it again. I still own one object from that apartment, though, an artwork that was hanging on the wall when I moved in that I haven't been able to part with. It reminds me of that neighborly, and anything relating to the big city is just too damn big. My graduating class size was 14, including myself. That is small. I experienced many things one might describe as paranormal or supernatural while growing up there, but one event in particular stands out among all the others. When I was a sophomore in high school, my science teacher / coach handed out a photocopied topographical map of the town to anyone who wanted it. Photocopied topographical map. I thought it would be really cool to have something like that, so I raised my hand for one. This was in the mid-90s, so there was no Google Earth at the time, or Google for that matter. As I'm perusing the map, I see the school and 2 cemeteries at either end of the road the school sits on. The black cemetery at one end and the white and much larger cemetery at the other. But then I noticed there was a 3rd cemetery just south of the large white cemetery, sitting right in the middle of a pasture behind the power plant. I was like, that can't be right. Well, I filed it in the back of my head, but remained curious about it for years. The mysterious cemetery that nobody I asked about knew about. Fast forward a few years. I'm 19 or so, and while hanging out with some friends telling scary stories, I mentioned this place. Of course, everyone gets interested, so we set out in the middle of the night to find it. It took a couple of hours of checking the map against our location in this huge pasture, but we finally found an area fenced in with old barbed wire that did not have a cattle gate like all the others did around it. We poked around a bit inside and found a headstone. We had found it. This was the first of several return forays into the night that we would make over the months, and they were all uneventful. Until they weren't. My best friend and I decided one night that we would go back out there and see it again, like really look around this time. Usually by the time you walked the couple of miles to get out there, you were too tired to spend more than a few minutes and were ready to go home pretty quickly. But this time, we planned to linger a bit. Yep, so it was about 1 a.m. and we were watching out the front window just waiting for a certain car to go by. As the town cop, there was only one, went by right on schedule. We slipped out the door and started making our way to the other side of town. We avoided open spaces as much as possible since we didn't want to get in trouble. Down the old dirt road, set in a field, run across the street and slip behind the baseball field all the way around until we reached the cemetery road. I hate this road. It's just an old single-lane blacktop road that cuts through the woods. The way the trees surround it and grow over it in the summer, which is when the story takes place, it turns into a half-mile-long dark tunnel with nothing but dead people waiting at the other end. While we soldier on and start walking down the road, almost instantly we find ourselves in nearly pitch blackness. There was no moon on this night, but a little bit of starlight sprinkles the ground. As we're nearing the halfway point, we hear a noise to our left, a whump, whump, whump sound. We turn and see this huge white object flying at us really quickly through the trees. We jump, we curse, we make noises we would not have admitted to making at that age. Then the huge white object turns right as it reaches the fence. It's a horse. We think about considering this a sign, but like fools we don't, and we continue down the road, flanked now by a white horse. We break out of the trees and reach the cemetery. Everything goes according to plan here. We climb the stairs, I've been in a lot of cemeteries over the years, and nothing really bothers me, or none of them do except for this one. It doesn't really look spooky or anything, maybe because I know so many people who are buried there. We get about halfway back, then climb over the fence into the pasture. So like from one cemetery to the pasture with the other. Now just a quick jaunt out to the hidden cemetery. About another more. I kept going. Finally, I revealed the top few inches of a full-sized headstone. It had sunk probably 2 feet. My friend had come over by this point and was on the outside of the fence so he could have a better view. I turned around where I'm still squatted and look at the small stone again. I say, didn't old graves used to sometimes have both a headstone and a footstone? And he goes, yeah. Then I shine my light at the ground right below the footstone, and I hear him curse as my blood runs cold. Right there, illuminated by my light, as if it were covered by only a quarter inch of dirt, was a pair of skeletal feet. I slowly tracked my light towards me along the ground. Lower legs, upper legs, a pelvis. I don't even think I was breathing at that point. The light continuing towards me, I see a pair of hands, arms, rib cage. Then I was pointing my light straight down. I'm sure you're wondering, but no, there was no skull looking up at me because I was squatting directly on top of it. I'm sure that from reading stories like this, you may begin to wonder if things of a metaphysical nature exist. If people are truly capable of superhuman feats. Well, I can tell you that my feats definitely became superhuman that night, and I learned to fly. I can barely remember my feet touching the ground as we sprinted the entire half-mile back to the main cemetery fence. We vaulted that fence at nearly the same moment and landed in waist-deep fog. Somehow, in the hour or so since we had left that cemetery, like the real one, a fog had rolled in that concealed everything except for the tippy tops of the tallest headstones. After what we had just experienced, you can only imagine what we were envisioning crawling around under the cover of the fog. We very quickly made our way through the cemetery, going slow enough to avoid tripping over everything, then ran over the steps, getting us the hell out there. Once outside the fence, we were also outside of the fog. It was a chain link fence, so how did the fog not clear it? We sort of power walked down the spooky tree tunnel of doom. Luckily, the horse didn't reappear because we probably would have died of a heart attack. As we exited the tunnel and turned back behind the baseball field, we thought we were in the clear. We're heading back toward the street when I noticed something extremely odd. I get my friend's attention and point up. The sky, which had been normal black with twinkly stars, now appeared dark red, and there was a single cloud right above us. I will swear to this day, it looked like a hand. We ran all the way back home. Maybe an hour or 2 after we went to sleep, I woke up suddenly for no reason. When I opened my eyes, above me, I saw it. 4 feet above the bed, sort of floating and looking straight down, was a disembodied head. I tapped my friend, and then I struck him. He woke up and mumbled a confused "what?" I said, without moving my lips as much as I could, "Look up." He turned and looked. He didn't say anything. I said again, not moving my mouth, "Do you see it?" He nodded his head. We lay there for several seconds, neither of us moving. Then he fell back to that age-old defense against monsters, ghosts, and boogeymen. He pulled the covers over his head. I followed suit, a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old, both hiding under the covers. And you know what? I'm not ashamed to admit that. Morning came, everything seemed normal again, and we agreed that we had received some sort of warning. "Stay off my lawn, you damned kids." And we agreed to do just that. Okay, this is the third story. If I'm counting right, I think I'm right. Okay, called The Red House. It's a story from this person's mother. My mother grew up poor. My grandpa worked at the sewage plant, and my grandma was a lunch lady for the local school and did laundry and cleaning in the summers. They were extremely frugal and were saving for a house of their own. In the meantime, they rented apartments in bad neighborhoods to save on rent. One day, they saw an advertisement for an upper apartment. An older years old, and my grandma was pregnant with her second child, so safer is what they wanted. They decided to take it. My mom drove us past it a few years ago. It's now painted a bright, sunny yellow, but at the time they moved in, it was a rusty red, barn red. The paint was cheap. The lower unit was vacant, which suited them just fine. After years of being packed like sardines in tiny apartments stacked on top of each other, it was nice and almost luxurious. The trouble started a few weeks in. Windows would shut by themselves. Old houses can be unpredictable, they thought, but sometimes the windows would also open by themselves, which was a bit harder to explain. It was summer, so they left the windows open most of the time. Their next door neighbors started to complain about noises. "Why are you flushing the toilets and slamming things all day?" they said. My parents were stumped, as they both usually worked, and my mom was at Nana's house during the day. They assumed that the lower unit was being rented and worked on, but looking into the windows revealed no workers, no people, just dust. Then my mom started to have nightmares, not the usual type. Terrors, night terrors, screaming. She would be inconsolable. My grandma would rock her to sleep, would sometimes fall asleep with my mom, her head against the wall, and my mom in her crib. One night, she heard footsteps, over and over. My mom woke up, stared at my grandma, and whispered, "It's here, it's here." The sounds were coming from the back of the closet. My grandma yelled for her husband. Grandpa peeled back the wood panel behind the closet. There were a set of stairs from when the house was a single-family home. The owners had boarded them over. At my grandma's request, Grandpa grabbed a flashlight and looked around. There were no footprints in the thick dust, no disturbances to the net of cobwebs. So he nailed the panel back and sensibly suggested they all needed a bit more sleep. My mom slept in their room for a few nights, but ultimately was put back to sleep in her own room. The night she was put back was seared into her memory to the point she has repeated it many times and never deviates. She again heard the footsteps slowly coming up the stairs. She started to cry silently and lay in her crib, pretending to be asleep as the footsteps drew closer. She felt someone standing over her. Hoping it was one of her parents, she cracked an eye open. It was not Grandma or Grandpa. My mom describes him as an old man. Not old like Nana, but old like a mummy. Sallow skin, sunken cheeks, and long, gray, stringy hair. He smiled at her. He had broken brown teeth, sharp and jagged. He was shirtless, and she could see his skin was ragged and thick, like a callus. He had impossibly long fingers, topped with thick, sharp yellow fingernails. He reached into the crib. At this point, my mom screamed and screamed and screamed. Grandma and Grandpa finally stumbled into the room. The next day, they started finding a different place to live immediately. While they searched, my mom slept every night between her parents. I asked once why they took my mom seriously. She said, "They found me on the other side of the room, out of the crib, by the closet." It's creepy. Alright, and then we'll do a fourth story. That'll be the last story for tonight. 1, 2, 3, 4. Fourth story. This one is, say it with me, untitled. This happened to me a few years ago, and I still get chills every time I think about it. I agreed to watch my nieces and nephew for my brother and his wife at their house since they had to be out of town for the day. My nephew and one niece had school that morning, but my other niece was only 4, so she stayed home with me. We spent the morning watching cartoons and coloring until it was finally time for her nap. She was lying down on the couch, so I tucked her in with a blanket, making sure she was completely cocooned in the blanket, all nice and cozy. I turned the volume on the TV down till I could barely hear it, taking care not to wake her up, and went into the kitchen to work on my math homework. I'm really short, like only 4'10". My feet often don't touch the ground when I'm sitting down, so I tend to sort of swing She didn't seem worried about it at all, and since it was the middle of the afternoon, I stopped feeling creeped out. We went into the kitchen so I could get lunch ready, and she crawled under the table to get her doll that had somehow managed to end up there. While she was down there, she started making a raspy voice. Almost like a quack, but not like how kids will say quack when they're imitating ducks. She did this a few times and still hadn't come out from under the table. So I asked her, "Are you being a silly little duck?" She stopped for a second and stuck her head out from under the table and asked what I said. I repeated, "Are you a cute little silly duck quacking under there?" "I don't know. I don't like this." She calmly looked at me and said, "I'm not quacking." "Well, what noise are you making if it's not a quack?" She shrugged her shoulders and said, "I'm making the same noise as the boy." "Nope." "What boy?" I asked. "The boy under the table. He keeps making that noise and going like this," to which she starts touching her throat. A huge chill went up my spine as she made that noise when my brain made the connection. She was mimicking choking. She was imitating a little boy who appeared to be choking under the table, the same table under which I had felt something touch my leg not even an hour earlier. I pulled her out from under the table and told her we were going to go to the park until it was time to pick up her siblings, and we stayed out all day until their parents got back, and I have never even stepped foot back